Chapter 6. Daniel had an enormous grin on his face as he drove down US 41. Yeah, it was a good time for him. His car was purring right along. The new veggie fuel was working perfectly, as he knew it would, and such low emissions. He glanced down at the passenger seat next to him. Lying there were two more pieces of good ones, both of which would make Kelly happy. Traffic was rather heavy today. They were well into the snowbird season. All the tourists were down. He had to laugh. He could tell where some of them came from just by their driving styles. The New Yorkers were constantly cutting others off, flipping them off, and shouting all manner of profanity. Then there were those Michigan retirees. Why is it they never remembered to turn off their blinkers after they changed lanes? But the worst of the worst were the local retirees. Oh, they'd be a thorn in Daniel's side since he'd learned to drive. Half of them didn't bother to look when they changed lanes, and the other half did, but they didn't care if they were in the way. As Ronald and Fabio had told him back when they were learning to drive in high school, it's their road, we should all get out of the way or ride bikes. Passing the county administration building, his grin went ear to ear. Yeah, he had very good news for Kelly. A few blocks farther down, he saw the dance studio and pulled off into the parking lot. He grabbed both piles of papers and hopped out of the car. The studio was in a little strip mall, in amongst a number of other businesses. This was one of the old business areas of Port Charlotte, and it showed. The mall was worn and faded, the asphalt cracked and full of potholes, and the little landscape flower pots between the walkway and the parking lot were full of weeds and dead plants. Daniel couldn't help but think that the collection of stores were quite odd. A Salvation thrift store, a pizza restaurant, a deli, the dance studio, and then an employment agency for day labourers. The men were quite the rough, gruff types, and they generally just hung around the outside of the office waiting for work. They could tell that the studio was in transition between classes. That was the only time the girls spilled out onto the walkway. Some of them were going into the deli for a sandwich or a slice of pizza and then sitting around to eat. One little girl, Daniel couldn't tell her age from the back, headed down past the employment office toward the end of the building. "Hey, check it out," one of the workers said. Another worker nodded, a big dopey grin on his face. Daniel frowned. This was not good. He walked up to the workers and told them to have a bit more respect toward the ladies, or else he will have them all arrested. He bolted into the studio. Inside was a large room, a little desk and chair right by the door, and the far wall was one huge mirror. Milling about the place were Kelly, a bunch of little girls in their tights, and Miss Parks, the studio owner. Daniel had met her once, but he couldn't remember where. She was a pleasant woman, clearly someone who'd been dancing a good portion of her life. She had those dancer's legs, strong and lean, yet she did seem to go a bit overboard with the makeup. Not quite as bad as Tammy Faye Backer, but she was pushing it. Kelly smiled and crossed to Daniel and then frowned. "Daniel, what's wrong?" "You need to get the girls inside," he said. Miss Parks stepped from around the desk, a look of confusion mixed with concern on her face. "But they are—" "What's wrong, Daniel?" He gestured toward the door. It and most of the wall that separated them from the outside were glass, so it was easy to see what was going on out there. "There, what's wrong?" he snapped. "Those workers are far too interested in the girls out there having a snack." Miss Parks nodded. "Yes, that has been a problem, but that's why I have them stay right outside so we can keep an eye on them." "But one girl seems to have forgotten that," Daniel replied. "She just headed toward the end of the building, lunch in hand, and a couple of those workers would not stop looking at her." That was clearly all Miss Parks needed to hear. She was out the door and calling the girls inside. Kelly smiled broadly. "Way to go, Daniel." "Oh, it was nothing. Just trying to protect the kids," he replied. "Yeah, but lots of people wouldn't have done that," she said. "Well, a lot of people probably would have done more," Daniel said. "Maybe." "It was still good of you," Kelly said. "So what you got there?" she asked, gesturing at his pile of papers. Daniel held up the stack of posters. "Oh, these are the first printings of the poster for our weather show. I thought you'd want to see them and maybe ask if we can put some up around here." "Cool. Sure, I'll take a bunch. You got more for yourself?" Daniel nodded. "You bet. Tony helped me get a whole bunch of them done. I'm going to meet up with him and the boys later, and we'll plaster the area with them." "Way to go. You guys are well organized," she said. "What's that other thing you've got?" Daniel pulled the letter from his breast pocket as the grin on his face just about to explode. "Oh, this little thing, nothing much. Just a letter from the full committee of the National Science Board to yours truly." Let me guess," Kelly said, taking a letter from him. She held it against her forehead and closed her eyes as if she was concentrating very hard. "They've approved the Sub-Zero project, right?" "How'd you guess?" Daniel said. "Oh, please, that grin on your face. What else could it be?" Kelly replied. Daniel laughed. "Yeah, I guess I'm no good at hiding things." "So what's the next step with the program?" "I'm going up to Tampa next week to meet with the engineers." "So soon?" Kelly said. Well, they have to draw up a detailed budget to submit to the Congressional Committee. I think it's the Science and Technology Committee, but I'm not sure. Hey, who can tell what's what in Washington? Kelly nodded as a murmur of giggles echoed throughout the room. Daniel looked around. It seemed, for little girls, they already knew a lot about politics. A moment later, Miss Parks entered, half a dozen other girls in tow. I intend to speak to the director of that employment office, she said, her voice very firm. Having such men around my girls is not healthy. Kelly nodded. I agree. Daniel, is something wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost. Daniel's eyes were fixed on the last girl coming in, the one who'd been heading into clear and present danger. He couldn't believe it. Was that Jessica Robbins? Ah, Jessica, he said slowly. The girl nodded and gave him a big toothy grin, or sort of toothy. She was missing several of her front teeth, a petite thing. She still had those dazzling blue eyes like the ocean on a clear day, and that short brown hair, throwing out her arm as she gave him a hug. Didn't recognize me, did you, Uncle Daniel? She said. Kelly looked from one to the other, her brow wrinkling. Uncle? Not a real designation, Daniel said quickly. I've been friends with her parents, Greg and Anne, since before Jessica was born. Goodness, girl, last time I saw you, you were what, 5? What are you now, 7? 10? She shot back, letting go of him. Daniel's jaw dropped and everyone around them giggled. It took him a moment to recover, even as Miss Parks started the next lesson. Go on, you're not that old, he said. Jessica giggled. Yes, I am. Just had my birthday last week. Oh, and I missed it, Daniel said. Well, I'll just have to get you an extra big present to make up for it. How's that sound? You still like Dora and Barney? Jessica rolled her eyes. Uncle Daniel, I'm way past such silly things. Oh, okay, how about I call your mum and dad and we'll get together sometime before Christmas? Works for me, she chirped and headed out onto the dance floor. Daniel and Kelly stood by the table watching the class start. It was some sort of jazz dance. He slowly shook his head. Good God, where did the years go? Seems like yesterday I was chasing around her backyard. Yeah, time waits for no man or woman, Kelly said. My mother has a song she loves, always makes her cry. It's by ABBA and is something about time slipping through your fingers. Ah, very appropriate. I feel the same way when I see my little sister in college, or worse, at the beach in her suit, and those men watching her. They all have mean eyes, you know that? Kelly laughed. Yes, Daniel, I can well imagine my father says the same thing. Good man, Daniel said. Okay, I'm off now. Okay, see ya. Got to help with class. With that, Kelly went to help the littlest students with their moves, and Daniel headed out the door. The workmen were still there, and they looked none too happy. Daniel smiled. Yeah, he'd done a good thing. Climbing back into his car, he now headed up US 41 and toward his next stop. While he was stopped at a traffic light, he glanced back at the back seat. Yeah, the cans were all in place. It didn't take long, and he was pulling into the entrance of the college. He now knew the way around back to the kitchen area quite well. Once at the receiving area, he parked and hopped out. Yeah, there was good old Olga just inside the door. She gave him a big smile and threw the door open. Ah, there's my little Daniel. How are you today? She said. You looking thin. You want to come in for a bite to eat? Daniel rolled his eyes. I'm fine, dear lady. Goodness, such a mother hen you are. He pulled out the tanks from the back seat as her eyes narrowed. Hen, is that good thing? She asked, as she opened the truck bay. Yeah, that's a good thing, Daniel replied. Together, they set the cans on the floor in front of the storage vats, and Daniel got out his hoses and hand pump. Soon the oils were flowing into the tanks. Ah, Olga, I do have something to ask you about, if you've got time. She slid her well-worn and well-padded stool over and sat down. For you, Daniel boy, always. You pulls up chair and tell Dr. Olga your troubles. Daniel sat on one of the other kitchen stools and kept turning the handle of the pump. Well, there's this lady I know. Kelly, Olga said. Daniel's jaw dropped. How'd you know? It was now time for Olga to roll her eyes. Daniel, it is quite obvious you has feelings for her. What problem? You likes her, she likes you? How can you know that? Olga tilted her head back and laughed, long and hard. Her great mouth of gold teeth just about glittered in the sunlight flooding in the door. Oh, Daniel, for very smartly man, you can be quite dumb on some things, she said. You not sees how she looking at you all time, how she always wants to be with you all time. Well, but that's just for our show about the weather thing, he said. Daniel, you needs to understand about subtexting, Olga said. His brow wrinkled. What's that? It's when people say one thing, but there's meaning under words. You sees that in movies and plays all the time, and woman looks for it a lot. Let's see, me think of example. Oh, I knows. If you offer lady diet soda, you might just be being courteous, but she read it as you think she's fat. Okay, you lost me, Daniel said. How does diet soda equate to that? She needs to follow female thoughts. Diet soda is what most people who want to lose weight drinks. So you offers it. It means you think she needs to lose weight, so you must think she's fat. Daniel chewed his lip as he tried to digest the roundabout thought processes of the female brain. I don't know, I just don't see it, Daniel said. But I suppose that's to be expected, so what do you suggest I do about, her? A good way to start is having a shared interest, Olga replied. You has the storm show, that's goodly. She has anything other? Daniel shook his head. Not really. Looks for a thing else to shares, and when you can, try asking her to do something simple. Some ladies prefer slow going, so rather than big date, just asks to be grabbing lunch or sandwich. Goodly way to break up ice, Olga said. Daniel laughed. Thanks, Olga, but the phrase is break the ice. Okay, I'll give it a try. It only took a shorter time to fill all tanks, and then they got them back in his car. Daniel was always amused at how strong Olga was. For a woman of her unknown or at least unspoken years, she was one fit lady. Tony had said she was going to live to be 100 by sheer willpower alone. As they finished, a huge mass whisked by the door, and Daniel jumped in surprise. A moment later, Roscoe came racing into his view, and after that, Tony rolled into view and gave a deep bow. Greetings and felicitations, my dear friends, he said, his tone happy and playful. Tony, what the hell are you doing on those things? Daniel said. The man was on rollerblades. He rolled and zipped about the parking lot, clearly enjoying himself. It was obvious that he was an old hand at this, and Roscoe seemed to love bounding after him. A little training session for the college's new mascot, he said. We getting new one? Olga said. Tony nodded. Yeah, young fellow by the name of Fabio seems a great guy, but he can't handle these skates to save his life, so I've been enlisted to train him on the art of smooth movement. Daniel stepped out next to his car and looked around. Fabio's going to be the new mascot. Wait until I tell Kelly and Gabby about that. So, okay, then where is he? Seems you've lost him. Tony rolled on over to the car, did a spin, and looked around. It does appear I've misplaced the lad. Oh well, it's our first lesson. I'll go track him down and make sure he's okay. Later, dude. With that, he was off, Roscoe close on his heels. Daniel and Olga laughed to see them take off. What a pair of characters. Well, thanks again, Olga, for your oils. I'll be going now, Daniel said. Not a problem, she replied. And so the car, it is running on your veggie petrol, okay? Like a top. That's good? Daniel laughed. Yes, quite good. See you next week then. Olga gave him a wave and closed the door of the kitchen. He got back into his car and drove off. Passing by the library, he caught sight of Tony and another young man. They were right out in front of the library. At first, Daniel had to wonder why they'd picked that area to practice. After all, it was usually pretty crowded. Then he figured it out. Jennifer was out there doing a little book fair. As it was Saturday, she wasn't in her usual librarian suit, but in a casual dress. Daniel had to admit she could make torn jeans look great. The knees were torn out, and then the pants were quite snug to her curvy legs. If Daniel didn't know better, he'd have thought the pants were spray painted on her. If that didn't increase readership at the library, nothing would. As much as Daniel would have liked to stop and admire the view, he needed to get down to the marina and crank up the distillery. After all, he needed more go-go juice for his trusty car. When that was done, he'd think about going home. What with the holidays, Pop was drinking a lot more these days and was not at all pleasant to be around, so Daniel's time was better spent on his work. It didn't take long for him to get down to the marina, and he easily transferred all the tanks to his processor. In no time, he'd have more fuel for his car. He checked his watch. The boys would be along soon, so he closed things up, got the posters out, and waited for them to arrive. A week later, Mr. Smith stopped in at the local branch of Bank of America. He had the money card that General Lowe had procured for him and the PIN. He stepped over to the ATM, put in the card, and punched in the code. Smith grinned. Yes, this was the final piece of the puzzle. He printed out a receipt and headed out to his car. The address of Alex Mayhew's house was saved into the GPS in Smith's car, so he was able to get there in no time. He looked the place up and down. These common Americans took such pride in their plain homes, someone needed to teach them about humility. Well, that was for another time. Right now, he merely wanted to, what was that phrase the General used? Churn the waters? Chum the waters? Climbing out of his BMW, he stepped up to the front door and knocked. He was greeted by a long silence, so he knocked again. Finally, the door opened, and there stood Alex Mayhew. Smith recognized him from the data provided to him and knew that Daniel would not be around today. The only unknown was the sister. Would she be there to cause trouble? Yes? Hello, what you want? Alex said. Smith's nose wrinkled. God, what stench. Did this man not believe in common hygiene? He obviously needed to bathe, and clearly he hadn't shaved in days. Smith blinked as his eyes began to water. Oh, he was putting in for hazardous pay for this assignment. Still, he would do his job as instructed. Mr. Mayhew, I am Mr. Smith with Bank of America. Could I speak to you about something? Alex's wrinkled old brow grew even more wrinkled. A bank man making a house call? Boy, something big must be up. I haven't had one of those in a long time. Well, come on in. Can I offer you a drink? Smith frowned. He was under strict orders to appear to be completely American, but his faith demanded him to avoid liquor. Still, this old man seemed already intoxicated. His eyes were glazed over and his speech a bit slurred, so he would probably not notice if Smith avoided actually drinking anything. Ah, these infidels and their unholy ways. His eyes focused on the room behind Mr. Mayhew. He could see the kitchen beyond the living room. Excellent. Where there was a kitchen, there was also a sink. He could pour the foul drink out a little at a time while they talked. Once the old man was well and truly drunk, he'd be easy to influence. Yes, please, thank you. I'd love a drink, Smith said. Alex gestured for him to come in. He entered and looked about the room. Yes, this would be all too simple a task. Up in Tampa, Daniel had a near-perfect meeting with the engineering staff. These were Daniel's kind of people, so he supposed that meant they were all geeks. They went over the full specs for the Sub-Zero plans. He answered all their questions, and they gave their approval to the project. Once they were through dotting the I's and crossing the T's, the staff said they would write up the final report and send it off to the Congressional Committee for review. From there, Daniel headed out and left MacDill Air Force Base. The guys had said they'd wait for him over at Busch Gardens and to give them a call once he was done. He popped out his cell phone and dialed as he drove off the base. So, big man engineer, Ronald said. How'd it go? You knocked their socks off? Well, it went okay. Let's just leave it at that, Daniel replied. Okay, so we'll wait for you near the theatre where the ice show is put on, okay? Oh, we've got a surprise for you. Huh? Daniel said, his brow wrinkling. What are you guys up to? Oh, you'll see, Ronald said, and then hung up before Daniel could say more. Oh man, what juvenile antics had those three gotten into? Truly they had earned the nickname the Three Stooges. Of course, once Daniel joined in, people called them the Four Marx Brothers. There was always an argument as to which one was Zeppo. If anything, they were two Grouches and two Marpos. A short time later, Daniel pulled into the parking lot at the park, jumped out, and made his way inside. It had been a while since he'd been to the park, but he easily found the theatre. It was funny, he still remembered his family's first trip to Florida and them coming to Busch Gardens. He'd been only 6 and had begged to go to Walt Disney World, but his father would hear none of it. No, it was too expensive, and besides, his father wanted the free beer of Busch Gardens. The place had grown since then, and the distillery was long gone, yet there was still the free beer, albeit you couldn't get as much as you used to. Daniel liked that, much less chance for auto accidents after you left the park. And when you considered how litigious society America had become, people were suing each other right and left. It made sense for the park to cut back on the free alcohol they gave out. Outside the theatre, Daniel spotted John and Ronald, but where was Tony? He looked, and then let out a little squeak of surprise. There he was, standing with Kelly. Oh, these guys were worse than Olga when it came to trying to set Daniel up on a date. He had to wonder, had she told them about their conversation? No, she was too good a lady to do that. Tony, a huge grin on his face, gave Daniel a little nod. Hey, my main man, look who we just happened to run into here. Uh-huh, Daniel said, his words brief, but the tone making it clear that he didn't believe a word of it. Hey, Kelly, good to see you. She smiled. And you, Daniel, how'd the meeting go with the engineers? Great. So, Daniel, you going to enlighten us on this thing you've created? Fabio asked. Guys, let's get inside and get our seats first, okay? Tony said. The others agreed and made their way inside. The theatre was huge, a beautiful recreation of one of the old classic movie houses of long ago. Many rows of seats faced a large stage, now cut off from their view by a rich-looking curtain. Let's see. John, the director at the theatre, said it was called a traveller. Daniel had no idea why they didn't just call it the curtain, but that's theatre people for you. Like engineers, they like to come up with fancy names for things. As they were fairly early for the show, they easily found seats and made themselves comfortable. Daniel gave a little shiver. The place was quite chilly, even to a transplanted New Englander like him. He knew that was because the theatre featured an ice show, so it had to be kept cold. Tony and Fabio turned around in their seats so they could face Daniel and the others. Okay, so what's the deal with these submarines? Tony said. Daniel gave them a rundown on the Sub-Zero project. They were all sufficiently impressed. So what's the next step? Fabio asked. Once the project is approved, the subs will be pulled in and the modifications will be made, Daniel explained. The plan is to run a test next season. Ronald's brow wrinkled. What season? Oh wait, hurricane season, right? Daniel nodded. Yeah, ideally we'll wait for the first tropical depression to form and then send out the subs. What about a full storm, Daniel? Fabio asked. You going to try it on one of them? I don't see the point. Why wait for a storm to build up? We nip it in the bud fast. We prevent it from ever getting too strong. If we wait, it will be much more difficult to disperse. To be honest, I don't know if that Sub-Zero could take down a major storm. Well, let's just hope that we never have to find that out, Kelly said. You going to be in charge of the refit of the subs? Oh no, that's something for the engineers to handle, but I'll be available for consultation. Tony's face broke out in a huge smirk. Oh, you hear that, guys? We now know a consultant. Looks like you're moving up in the world, Daniel. Ronald laughed. Yeah, just don't forget about us little people you stepped on during your climb to the top, okay? Sure, people, Daniel said. I'll reserve a chapter in my memoir for you. Oh, one for each of us, Fabio said. Don't be silly, you're not worth that much space. Daniel shot back a grin on his face. The show soon started and they all turned to watch. After that, Fabio suggested that they hit the roller coasters. He loved the Scorpion. Tony wasn't impressed with that one and wanted to hit Mon too. Over in the Egypt section, they compromised and decided to hit all of them, saving Gwazi, the huge wooden one, for last. Daniel noticed that the boys seemed to arrange for Kelly to sit with him on every ride. Oh, talk about playing matchmakers. Still, Daniel didn't mind. He was getting more and more comfortable with her. After going down the tidal wave, they strolled over to one of the snack areas to get a drink. As they sat down, Daniel saw the old log flume ride. God, that one was still around. Penny for your thoughts? Kelly said. Huh? What? Daniel replied. She laughed. You got such a faraway look, I was wondering what was on your mind. Daniel smiled. Just lost in a memory. The first time I came here. That was the ride my dad and I went down. My mum took a picture of us coming down it. She didn't go on it? Kelly asked. No, she was pregnant with my little sister at the time. Oh well, that's a good reason to skip it. So you guys ready to come home? Daniel nodded. I sure am. This has been a long, tough day for me. And coming up is our first weather show, right, Kelly? Yeah, we're going to Venice Elementary Monday. The kids are going to love the stuff Daniel's come up with for the show. Elementary? Tony said. Hey, what about us grown-ups? When do we get to see it? Don't you think you're going to be overly generous with that designation? Ronald said. But what stretch of the imagination are we grown-ups? Yeah, you're a professional student, Fabio added and laughed. You ever going to graduate? Hey, as long as I stay in college, I draw a nice sum from my dear Aunt Marnie's trust, so I'm taking my dear sweet time to grow up. They all had a good laugh and then headed for the main gate. Saying goodbye, they went off to their respective cars and headed down I-75 for home. Daniel switched on his iPod and kicked back with some nice music. Yeah, this has been a good day. And the guys, while silly with their attempt at throwing Daniel and Kelly together, had meant well and hadn't embarrassed him. He reached home about 2 hours later and pulled into the driveway. Hopping out, he headed inside and was surprised to not see Pop passed out on the couch. Daniel? Is that you? Came his voice from the master bedroom. Yeah, Pop, I'm home, he called out. A moment later, Alex appeared in the doorway. He did not look happy. Daniel, I need to speak to you about the joint account.